Welcome back, YouTube. Today I'm going to walk you through how to lose 38 pounds in just 12 weeks. The latest intake of my 12-week fat loss group, the Transformation Network, came to a finish, and one of the members within that, Kay, managed to drop 38 pounds over those 12 weeks. Now that's an impressive amount of weight to lose over 12 weeks. That equates to like 3 pounds a week lost on a consistent basis, which is very, very good going. And I thought it would be then a good idea to walk through how we managed to achieve those level of results. Because the reality was that there were no drastic changes made. There was no extreme methods used. It was actually all very simple, straightforward, yes, in theory, but simple and straightforward methods that allowed us to get these results. Now, before we break it down and have a look at what helped us get these results, which is only really 4 fundamental, let's say, pillars, it is important to understand and to mention that obviously the commitment from Kay is a huge factor. No matter what method you choose to use, no matter how you go around your goal, the commitment, the desire to get the results and reach that end goal, the mindset around that is obviously going to be a big deal and is going to help. But let's move on to the 4 pillars that we use to help us get these results. And again, in theory, this is very simple and straightforward, but this is all you need. Okay, so number 1 is simply that, keep it simple, right? So I know I said the methods that we used were simple, straightforward, which I'm going to come on to, but it is important to make sure that throughout your process you try and do exactly that. Whatever it is you're doing, keep it simple and straightforward. Why? Because one of the biggest reasons people fail with their goals is that they just get overwhelmed, they get confused, and then they get frustrated, right? If you have 101 things you're trying to manage, and you don't even really understand how to manage these things in the first place, you are literally creating an absolute mess, a storm, something that you cannot control. Whereas if you are just managing a few things, a few important things, and keeping it simple to manage them because you understand how to manage them, why you're managing them, all of a sudden the process becomes a lot more straightforward and simple. Okay, so number 2, the second thing we then go to focus on is our food/calorie intake, right? When it comes to dropping body fat, you have to be in a calorie deficit, which means taking in less food calories than you're expending, okay? So in that equation, the 2 biggest things you have is food intake and expenditure. Once you understand this and once you realize this, these are the 2 of the most fundamental things you then have to get, let's say, control and consistency over. So the first thing we focus on is food intake or calorie intake. Why? Because calories and food intake is going to be, out of the 2, let's say the bigger one, the easier one to actually adjust your energy balance with, right? For example, if you're wanting to reduce your calories by 400, depending on where your calories are currently sat, but as a rule of thumb, it's a lot easier to reduce food by 400 than it is to increase energy expenditure by 400, okay? To actually go out and burn an extra 400 calories, you're going to have to be doing quite a lot, and it's actually probably going to take a lot of time, okay? To just reduce 400 calories from your diet, from your nutrition, is a lot easier. Now, again, depends on the individual, depends on the situation. If you're already on very low calories, that might not be an option. But as a general rule of thumb, the first thing to focus on is to get control and consistency over that intake, because 1, it's so important, it's a big part of the equation, but 2, because it can be a much simpler and more effective way to put yourself into a calorie deficit. This can be done, in various different ways. You can use calorie tracking, you can use food diary. You've got to find whatever method is going to work for you. In this example, with Kay over the 12 weeks, we did decide to track calories, okay? There was no issue with it. We found it very simple, straightforward. We found it effective, okay? So all we did was start tracking calories, get an idea of where calories need to be in relation to then the fat loss response, weight loss response that we're going to see, okay? So we track calories, relate that to the progress we're seeing, and then we can make adjustments. Once we've found that calorie target that we're happy with, alongside obviously expenditure, which we're going to come on to in a minute. But once we've found that, we just then need to we need to make sure we're staying consistent with that number given. And again, consistency here is key, okay? If you're not consistent and one day calories are here, the next day they're up here, the next day they're up here, then one day they're back down here, and it's very much all over the place, you're going to find it very hard to see any real consistent rate of progress, okay? If people aren't seeing consistent rates of progress, that can often cause again frustration and for them to essentially, not be happy with it and give in, okay? Now, yes, calories are never going to be exactly consistent to the actual number, right? However, we need to try and be as consistent as we can, let's say relatively day to day, or let's say at least week to week, to make sure we're getting that consistent progress. Okay, and then thirdly, we have expenditure, but more importantly, daily expenditure, okay? So, like I was just talking about with the equation of putting ourselves in a calorie deficit, intake and output, expenditure, are the two big equations. We've spoken about intake. Next is output, okay? Now, like I said, it's harder to, make bigger adjustments in terms of calories with expenditure than it is with intake, because to increase expenditure by a decent amount, that is going to take more time, more effort. However, one of the easiest ways to increase expenditure by a decent amount on a consistent basis is through your daily expenditure. So before we even concern ourselves with training sessions, we're focusing on instead how to make sure we can increase daily expenditure to make sure that our energy expenditure is up on a consistent basis. And the way we do that is by focusing on steps. So again, like with the food intake or the calorie intake, we find a method of controlling our daily expenditure, our steps. So for a lot of people, that's going to be tracking steps, which at this day and age, when you can do it on your phone or you can do it on watches, isn't too much of a hassle, right? So again, in this situation with Kay, we started tracking our daily steps. We saw what was comfortable at the moment, and we saw where we could potentially push that, or where we needed to potentially push that in relation to our calorie intake to then get the response and the progress that we were after. Once we identified that number, once again, it was all about being consistent. But what we found with Kay was, this is very much the case with a lot of people, is that once we've done these initial two pillars, right, we've found our intake where it needs to be in relation to our expenditure, we found our expenditure and where it needs to be in relation to our intake, and we're then being consistent with these amounts, we're getting a fat loss response, okay? You can often just do food intake and daily expenditure and you can get a fat loss response, okay? And what we found was that this was the case. So we adjusted our steps, adjusted our food intake, and we were getting a good fat loss response. Just before we even really started driving home, training, and even stuff like protein intake and stuff like that, we just address these first two pillars before we then even need to worry about, let's say, the more finer details. And then lastly, the fourth pillar is consistency, but more importantly, accountability. Okay, so like I said, once you've got this equation, this calorie deficit set, okay, from there, you just need to make sure you're being consistent with those targets you've now got set. Okay, if you're being consistent with those targets that you've now got set that are giving you a fat loss response, guess what? You're consistently going to get a fat loss response. Now, one of the best ways and most important ways of making sure you stay consistent is accountability. Okay, you either need to, one, put systems in place to keep you accountable, or two, have someone keep you accountable. Okay, now the beauty of, with Kay in this situation was that she was part of the Transformation Network group. She was part of the 12-week group, which meant two things. One, I have systems in place within that group, check-in sheets and whatnot, to help keep individuals accountable, help keep themselves accountable. They have to put these data into check-in sheets. So each day, they're almost essentially double checking on themselves. Secondly, at the end of each week, we have check-ins. So they check in with me at the end of each week so I can help keep them accountable and keep them on the right track. But accountability is so important for consistency, and consistency is vital for results. And I do not kid you when I say those 4 pillars right there, keeping it simple, getting control and consistency of intake, getting control and consistency of daily expenditure steps, and then being consistent through accountability are the main 4 reasons as to why and how we dropped 38 pounds over 12 weeks. I do not kid you when I say that is solely the main reasons. Now, yes, we did also then delve a little bit further into, let's say, the finer details, such as making sure we then add in training sessions, to add in some resistance training. Kay was doing 2 to 3 times a week. Okay, so nothing crazy. We did make sure we were looking at protein intake to again, focus more on fat loss and the retention of muscle mass. And yes, we did talk about stuff like hunger management and stuff like that. Yes, which is important, but they are the finer details. Okay, if we had done and focused on those 3 things but forgot the other 4 pillars, there's not a chance we would have got the results that we did. Hopefully, this video has helped and given you some insight into potentially your own fat loss goal and results. If it did, please drop a like. If you have any questions throughout any of this, how we got about it, throw them down below and I'll get back to you. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I walk through week to week how to help you get the results you're after. And lastly, I run the transformation group 3 times a year. So if you are interested in grabbing a spot, want some more information, check the link in the comments below, and I will get back to you. Take care and have a great rest of your day.